My name is Jane, and I was 25 years old when I stood alone at my grandfather Harold's funeral, watching my parents pull up in their luxury cars. The same parents who threw me out at 15 calling me a financial burden, they had no idea what was coming. When the lawyer shuffled his papers, smiled at me and read, "The heir to everything is the one who kept my secret safe," no one expected him to point directly at me. But the $20 million revelation was just the beginning. If you're watching this story, drop a comment letting me know where you're from. Hit that like and subscribe button because what happened next changed everything about family loyalty and what it truly means to be wealthy. I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood in Boston, in a house that looked perfect from the outside. White picket fence, neatly trimmed lawn family photos, hanging in perfectly aligned rows in the hallway. But inside those walls, things were different. My parents, Thomas and Catherine Armstrong, were always more concerned with appearances than actual family connections. From my earliest memories, I can recall my mother fussing over my clothes before family gatherings, not because she wanted me to be comfortable, but because she worried what her friends might think. "Janies, you can't wear those shoes. What will the Wilsons say? They'll think we can't afford proper footwear for our children." It was always about what others would think, never about what I needed or wanted. My younger brother, Adam, was different. 3 years younger than me, he was the golden child from the moment he was born. He had my father's athletic build and charm, and my mother's social graces. When Adam brought home B grades, there was celebration. When I brought home straight, as there was merely a nod of acknowledgement. "That's nice, Jane," my father would say, without looking up from his newspaper. "Did you hear Adam scored the winning goal at his soccer game today?" But what my parents lacked in warmth and attention, my grandfather Harold more than made up for. My father's father was a quiet, thoughtful man who had built a business from scratch. He lived modestly in a cabin by Whisper Lake, about an hour from our house. From the outside, you'd never guess he had money. He drove a 10-year-old truck, wore the same flannel shirts, until they had holes in them, and fixed things himself rather than buying new. "Waste, not want, not Janie," he'd tell me, as we'd fix a broken chair together. "Most people throw away perfectly good things just because they're a little worn. They're missing the beauty in something that's been weathered by time." Starting when I was 7, I would spend weekends at Grandpa Harold's cabin. My parents were more than happy to have me out of their hair, and Adam was always busy with sports or friends. Those weekends by the lake became my sanctuary. Harold taught me practical skills my parents never bothered with. He showed me how to fish, how to identify edible plants in the forest, how to fix a leaky faucet, and most importantly, how money really worked. "Money is just a tool, Janie," he would say as we sat on his porch counting the day's fishing catch. "It's not good or bad on its own. It's what you do with it that matters. Some people use hammers to build homes for those in need. Others use them to break windows." As I got older, I noticed my parents' resentment toward my relationship with Harold growing. I'd overhear their whispered conversations at night. "She spends too much time with your father," my mother would hiss. "He's filling her head with nonsense about simple living. We didn't work this hard to have a daughter who wants to live in the woods like some kind of hermit." My father would sigh. "What do you want me to do? Catherine Dad seems to prefer her company, and frankly, it gives us more time with Adam. His football coach says he has real potential. That could mean scholarships." What they didn't say, but what became increasingly clear as I entered my teen years, was that they were interested in Harold's money. They assumed he had saved a significant amount from his business, though he never flaunted wealth or discussed finances with them. Meanwhile, I had discovered a passion for art. I would sketch for hours at Harold's cabin, capturing the stillness of the lake at dawn, the gnarled hands of my grandfather, as he tied fishing lures, the family of deer that came to drink at the water's edge every evening. Harold noticed and quietly encouraged me. One weekend when I was 14, I arrived to find an easel canvases and a set of oil paints waiting on the porch. "Thought you might want to try something more permanent than those pencil sketches," he said casually, as if he hadn't just given me the most thoughtful gift I'd ever received. That's when the tension at home really escalated. My parents discovered I was researching art schools. "Art? What kind of career is that?" my father scoffed. "You need something practical, something that will pay the bills." "Harold put this nonsense in your head, didn't he?" my mother accused. "He's sabotaging your future because he knows it will upset us." I didn't understand the intensity of their reaction until one night I overheard them talking about Harold's money again. "He must be worth millions by now," my father was saying. "The business was valued at over $5 million when he sold it, and that was 15 years ago. God knows what he's done with it since then." "And he seems to favor Jane," my mother replied. "We need to be careful. If she alienates herself from us completely by pursuing this art nonsense, we might get cut out entirely." It was the first time I realized that my parents saw me as a potential pathway to wealth, not as their daughter, not as a person with dreams and aspirations of my own, but as a means to an end. It was the beginning of understanding who my family really was and what would eventually tear us apart. The summer I turned 15 was when everything changed. I was at Grandpa Harold's cabin for 2 weeks straight, the longest I'd ever stayed. My parents were taking Adam to football camp in Florida and had readily agreed to my grandfather's offer to keep me with him. It was during this stay that I discovered Harold's secret. I was looking for more canvas in his storage closet when I knocked over a box of old papers. As I scrambled to pick everything up, a leather-bound journal fell open. I wouldn't have read it, but my own name on the page caught my eye. "Took Janie to the shelter today," the entry read. "She has her mother's empathy, and none of her materialism, thank God. The way she connected with those children without judgment or hesitation reminds me why I started the foundation in the first place. Some people are born understanding what matters. I think Janie is one of them." I knew I shouldn't read more, but curiosity got the better of me. Page after page revealed a side of my grandfather I had never known. The journal documented his humble beginnings, growing up poor in rural Massachusetts, working multiple jobs to put himself through school, building his manufacturing business from nothing but a good idea and relentless work ethic. But what shocked me most was learning about his wealth. The business had indeed sold for millions. But that was just the beginning. Smart investments had multiplied his fortune several times over. And yet, he lived simply in this modest cabin, driving his old truck. Because Harold had a secret life. 3 days a week, he wasn't fishing or woodworking, as I had assumed during the school year. He was running a foundation that funded scholarships for underprivileged kids, supported domestic violence shelters, and provided startup capital for small businesses in disadvantaged communities. All anonymously. No buildings with the Armstrong name, no press releases, no charity galas where wealthy donors could show off their generosity. Just quiet, consistent support for people who needed it. When Harold found me with the journal, I expected him to be angry. Instead, he sat down heavily in his old armchair. "I suppose it was time you knew," he said. "But Janie, this has to remain between us. Your parents, they wouldn't understand." "Why not tell people?" I asked. "You're doing amazing things." He shook his head. "The moment you put your name on charity, it stops being about the people you're helping and starts being about you. Your father never understood that. Always wanted his name on things, recognition status. That's not why we help others." I promised to keep his secret. It was our special bond, this shared knowledge of his double life as a philanthropist. When I returned home after those 2 weeks, everything felt different. I could see my parents' materialism with new eyes, their constant striving for status symbols. They couldn't quite afford their dismissal of anyone who couldn't advance their social standing. And I made a decision. I would apply for a special arts high school that offered scholarships. I had the grades, and I'd been developing my portfolio in secret with Harold's encouragement. But my parents discovered my application and art supplies before I could submit everything. My mother found them while snooping through my room, a regular occurrence I had learned to expect. The fight that followed was unlike anything we'd had before. Art school? Are you trying to embarrass us? My mother screamed, waving my application in my face. What will we tell everyone? That our daughter is throwing her life away on some ridiculous fantasy. It's not a fantasy, I said, trying to stay calm. I have talent. The pre-portfolio review teacher said I could get a full scholarship. Talent doesn't pay bills, my father interjected. We've spent thousands on your education, on your clothes, on feeding you, and this is how you repay us, by becoming some starving artist. You act like I'm a financial burden, I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Maybe if you spent less on Adam's expensive sports equipment or Mom's designer purses. The slap came before I saw it coming, my mother's hand across my face. How dare you, she hissed. After all we've done for you, you ungrateful, selfish girl. My father stood up, his face red with anger. You have a choice, Jane. Give up this art nonsense and focus on a real education, or get out of this house. I thought he was exaggerating, using a threat to control me. I was wrong. I'm not giving up art, I said quietly. It's who I am. 2 hours later, I was standing on our front porch with a backpack of hastily packed belongings, the door locked behind me. It had started to rain, a cold autumn downpour that soaked through my jacket immediately. I had $37 in my pocket and nowhere to go. Friends' parents would call mine. Relatives lived too far away. So I walked to the bus stop and sat there, water dripping from my hair, trying to figure out what to do next. That's where Grandpa Harold found me, huddled on the bench as night fell. He'd tried calling the house and gotten a strange story from my mother about me staying at a friend's. Something felt wrong, so he drove into town. Janie, he said, his voice breaking as he saw me. My God, what happened? When I told him everything, I saw something change in his eyes, a hardness I'd never associated with my gentle grandfather. Get in the truck, he said. You're coming home with me. As we drove away, I looked back at the house where I'd grown up, the lights glowing warmly in the rainy darkness. I didn't know then that it would be years before I set foot inside again, or that by the time I did, nothing would be the same. The guest room at Grandpa Harold's cabin became my new home. It was small but cozy, with a window that looked out over the lake. Harold hung curtains I had never seen before, blue with white stars, and bought a proper desk where I could work on my art. My mother made those curtains, he told me, as he hung them carefully. I've been saving them. Seems like they were waiting for you. The first week my phone rang constantly with calls from my mother. I answered once only to hear her demand, I apologize and come home. You've embarrassed us in front of everyone, she said. Mrs. Winthrop asked where you were at church, and I had to lie. Did you tell her you threw me out? I asked. The line went silent for a moment. We did no such thing. You chose to leave because you couldn't follow simple household rules. That was the story they were telling everyone. Jane ran away. Jane was being rebellious. Jane chose art over family. After that call, Harold took legal action. As my grandfather, he was able to petition for guardianship, arguing that my parents had abandoned me. They fought it briefly, but when Harold's lawyer mentioned potential charges of child abandonment and evidence of my mother's physical abuse, they quickly changed tactics. Keep her then, my father told Harold during a tense meeting. But don't expect any help from us. Help, as it turned out, wasn't what Harold needed. He had more than enough resources to care for me. What surprised me was how he became not just my guardian, but my champion. He enrolled me in the arts-focused charter school, one town over. He drove me 40 minutes each way, every day, without complaint. He attended every parent-teacher conference, every art show, sitting proudly in the front row as I explained my work to visitors. My parents, meanwhile, made occasional attempts to reconnect, but only when they needed something. My father would call asking if Harold might help out with Adam's travel team expenses. My mother would drop by unannounced, commenting on how rustic our living situation was, while subtly inquiring about Harold's finances. "Your grandfather isn't getting any younger," she said during one such visit, eyeing the cabin critically. "Have you discussed his long-term care plans, his assets? Someone needs to be thinking about these things." That someone, it was clear, was meant to be me, reporting back to them. But my focus was elsewhere. I was thriving at my new school, maintaining a 4.0 GPA while developing my portfolio. I made friends who shared my passion for art, who didn't care about designer labels or social status. And I was learning more about Harold's foundation. After school, I would sometimes accompany him to meetings with community leaders, sitting quietly as they discussed programs and funding. Occasionally, he would ask my opinion on a scholarship candidate or a new initiative. "Fresh eyes," he would tell the others. "Jane sees things we might miss." As I turned 16, then 17, Harold's health began to show signs of decline. Nothing dramatic, just small changes. He tired more easily. His hands, once so steady when tying fishing flies, would sometimes tremble. He never complained, but I started taking on more responsibility around the cabin. I learned to cook his favorite meals, to change the oil in his truck, to manage the household budget. When he had a mild heart attack shortly after my 18th birthday, I was the one who found him, called the ambulance, and rode with him to the hospital. During his recovery, I took over more of his foundation work, serving as his eyes and ears. I would visit the shelter or the community center, take notes on what was needed, and bring the information back to him. "You're good at this, Janie," he told me as we reviewed funding proposals together. "You see the person behind the paperwork." My senior year of high school, I applied to art schools across the country and was accepted to several, including one in New York, with a generous scholarship. When the acceptance letter came, Harold insisted on a celebration dinner at the one fancy restaurant in our small town. To Jane he toasted, raising his glass, who never let anyone tell her who she should be. That night, as we drove home under a sky brilliant with stars, Harold pulled the truck over at our favorite spot overlooking the lake. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. "Not just for the school, but for who you've become. You lost your family, but never lost yourself." I looked at him. This man who had saved me in every way, a person can be saved. "I didn't lose my family," I said. "The real one was here all along." He smiled, his eyes bright with unshed tears, and we sat in comfortable silence, watching the moon's reflection ripple across the dark water. I was 20 years old and halfway through my art degree in New York when my parents suddenly reappeared in my life. I hadn't seen them in nearly 3 years, though Harold kept me informed of major family events. Adam had gotten a football scholarship to a state college. My father had been promoted. My mother was president of her garden club. It was a Sunday evening when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Jane, it's your mother. Her voice was softer than I remembered, almost hesitant. We've been thinking about you, she continued when I didn't immediately respond. Your father and I, we may have been hasty in our judgment. What followed was a carefully worded non-apology. They had been under stress. They hadn't understood my passion for art. They wanted to reconnect with their daughter. It might have seemed sincere if Harold hadn't called me the very next day to tell me he'd been diagnosed with early-stage prostate cancer. It's treatable, he assured me. Don't worry about coming home. Focus on your studies. But the timing was too suspicious. When I asked if my parents knew about his diagnosis, there was a telling pause. Your father called last week, Harold admitted. First time in years. Said he was concerned about my health, that he'd heard rumors I wasn't doing well. The rumors, as it turned out, had come from Harold's doctor's receptionist, who was friends with my mother's cousin. Small-town connections that had suddenly become very valuable to my parents. Despite Harold's protests, I came home for a weekend to check on him. And sure enough, my parents made an appearance at the cabin, bringing a casserole and concerned expressions. Dad, we want to help my father, said, placing a hand on Harold's shoulder. Family needs to stick together during health crises. My mother nodded earnestly. We can take shifts caring for you. Jane needs to focus on her education. Harold thanked them politely, but firmly declined. Jane visits when she can. I have home health services for the rest. I'm not an invalid yet. I noticed my mother's eyes scanning the cabin, lingering on the antique desk in the corner. The painting above the fireplace that Harold had mentioned was quite valuable. After they left, promising to return soon with more food, Harold sighed heavily. They think I'm dying, he said bluntly, and they're counting what they'll get when I do. I wanted to defend them, to believe their concern was genuine, but I had seen the calculation in their eyes. Over the next few months, my parents' reconciliation campaign intensified. They sent birthday and Christmas gifts to my apartment in New York. They called regularly with friendly, casual conversations. My mother even mentioned coming to see one of my gallery showings. We're so proud of what you've accomplished, she said. We always knew you had talent. It was as if the years of estrangement had never happened, as if they hadn't thrown me out in the rain, as if they hadn't called me an ungrateful burden. When I came home for spring break, I arrived a day earlier than expected. As I pulled up to the cabin, I was surprised to see my parents' car in the driveway. Harold had mentioned nothing about a visit. I entered quietly, hearing voices from Harold's study. Dad, be reasonable, my father was saying. You need to consider long-term care. These treatments aren't cheap. We should review your investments, make sure everything's in order. I stood frozen in the hallway, listening as my parents pressed Harold about his will, his bank accounts, the foundation I wasn't supposed to know about. Thomas Catherine Harold's voice was tired but firm. My finances are in excellent order. My attorney handles everything. But as your family, my mother persisted, we should be involved. What if you become incapacitated? What if decisions need to be made quickly? I'd heard enough. I walked into the study, making my presence known. The guilty expressions on my parents' faces confirmed everything. Jane, my mother exclaimed, recovering quickly. What a wonderful surprise! We were just checking on your grandfather's health plan options. I heard what you were checking on, I said coldly. An uncomfortable silence fell. Harold looked between us, then stood slowly. I think I need some air, he said. Jane, would you help me to the porch? As soon as we were outside, I exploded. They're vultures. They don't care about you at all. Harold patted my hand. I know exactly what they are, Janie. I've always known. The next day, my parents returned with Adam in tow. My brother had changed, grown broader and more confident, but there was a wariness in his eyes when he saw me. "Hey, Jane," he said awkwardly. "It's been a while." While our parents spoke with Harold in the kitchen, Adam and I sat on the dock, feet dangling above the cool lake water. "They're after his money, aren't they?" I asked bluntly. Adam winced. "It's not that simple. Dad's company is struggling. They remortgaged the house twice. They're desperate. So that makes it okay to circle a sick man like sharks." He sighed. "I didn't say that. But they're convinced you've been manipulating Grandpa all these years, positioning yourself to inherit everything." I laughed bitterly. "They threw me out, Adam. I was 15. Harold was the only one who cared what happened to me." "I know," he said quietly. "I wanted to contact you, but he trailed off. They controlled the narrative I finished for him. Let me guess. Rebellious Jane abandoned the family for selfish reasons." He nodded, unable to meet my eyes. "I should have known better. I'm sorry." I wanted to stay angry at him, but he looked genuinely remorseful. "You were a kid too," I said finally. Before we could talk further, our parents emerged from the cabin, faces tight with barely contained anger. "We're leaving," my father announced. "Adam, come on." I later learned from Harold that he had overheard them discussing their plans to contest his will if they didn't like its contents. That night he called his attorney and made changes to his estate plan. As my third year of art school began, Harold's condition worsened. The cancer had spread despite treatment. I wanted to take a semester off, but he wouldn't hear of it. "Your education comes first," he insisted. "I've made arrangements for home care." I compromised by coming home every other weekend, juggling coursework and caring for him. During one of these visits, Harold asked me to take over more aspects of his foundation. "The work needs to continue," he said, showing me files he'd kept meticulously organized. "These communities depend on the support." "I don't know if I can do it justice," I admitted. "You've built something amazing." He squeezed my hand. "You already are, Janie. You've been my partner in this for years now. I trust you to carry it forward." Meanwhile, my parents had launched a whisper campaign among family members, suggesting I was manipulating a sick old man, isolating him from his real family during his final days. Cousins and aunts, who had never bothered to visit Harold, suddenly called or wrote, expressing concern about his well-being and his will. "Ignore them," Harold advised. "People show you who they are when money enters the equation." As his health declined further, I spent more time at the cabin setting up a workspace so I could continue my art projects while caring for him. In his lucid moments, Harold would watch me paint, offering the same thoughtful observations he had when I was a child. "You see the light differently now," he noted, as I worked on a landscape of the lake at dawn. "There's more shadow in your work, more complexity." I looked at him, this man, who had taught me to see beyond surfaces, to find value in what others discarded. "I had a good teacher," I said. He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "The best students surpass their teachers. That's as it should be." By the time I turned 24, I had graduated with honors and started making a modest name for myself in the art world. I had a small studio in Brooklyn, but spent most of my time at the cabin with Harold. His cancer had progressed to stage 4, and the doctors had given him months, not years. I moved in full-time to care for him, working on commissioned pieces in the mornings while he slept, then spending afternoons reading to him, or simply sitting together on the porch, watching the wildlife around the lake. My parents visited more frequently now, always bringing expensive foods Harold couldn't eat or luxury items out of place in the simple cabin. They would talk loudly about family memories, as if volume could compensate for their years of absence. "Remember that fishing trip when Jane was 10, my father would say. You caught that enormous bass, Dad. We all thought you'd fall out of the boat." Harold would smile politely, though I knew he remembered the truth my father had been on a business trip that weekend. It had been just Harold and me in the boat. After these visits, Harold would be exhausted not just physically, but emotionally. "The performance is the most tiring part," he confided one evening after they'd left. "Pretending we're a normal family when we all know why they're really here." Each visit inevitably included casual inquiries about his financial affairs. "Have you considered donating to the new hospital wing?" my mother asked during one visit. "They're naming rooms after major donors. The Armstrong room has a nice ring to it." "I prefer my giving to remain anonymous," Harold replied, as he always did. My mother exchanged a look with my father. "But legacy is important. The Armstrong name should stand for something in this community." "Legacy isn't about names on buildings," Catherine Harold said quietly. "It's about the lives you touch and the values you pass on." As summer turned to fall, Harold's strength faded more rapidly. The home health nurse increased her visits to daily, and the pain medication made him sleep more often. In his waking hours, though, his mind remained sharp. One crisp October afternoon, he asked me to help him to his study. "There's something I need to show you," he said. From his desk drawer, he removed a small wooden box I'd never seen before. Inside was a single key and a letter. "When I'm gone," he said, "this goes to Mr. Wilson, my attorney, but you should know what it contains." The key, he explained, opened a safe deposit box at Boston First National Bank. The letter contained instructions for the distribution of his estate. "I've had a good life, Janie," he said, his voice steady, despite his frail body. "Made my share of mistakes, had my regrets, but finding you, watching you, grow into the person you are, that's been my greatest joy." I tried to stop him to say we had more time, but he shook his head. "Listen now, there's something I haven't told you, something beyond the foundation." Harold had been more successful than even I had realized. The business he'd built and sold had been just the beginning. Smart investments over decades had multiplied his wealth substantially. 20 million, he said, watching my face carefully. "Give or take. All carefully managed, all put to work, helping others." I was stunned. "But you live so simply. The cabin," he smiled. "The cabin is my palace. What would I do with a mansion, rattle around in empty rooms? No, this was always enough for me." He continued explaining that he had documented everything over the years, including my parents' treatment of me, their abandonment and their subsequent attempts to ingratiate themselves when they believed money was at stake. "They'll contest the will," he said matter-of-factly. "People like your parents always do. But I've made sure it will stand." A week later, Harold took a turn for the worse. The doctor advised moving him to the hospital, but he refused. "I want to die looking at my lake," he insisted, "not at a drop ceiling with fluorescent lights." My parents arrived within hours of being told his condition was critical. They stood awkwardly at his bedside, murmuring platitudes about family and love. When they left the room briefly, Harold gripped my hand with surprising strength. "Remember what matters," he whispered. "Not things, not status, people, connection, the quiet good you can do in the world." I nodded, fighting back tears. "And Janie," he added, his blue eyes holding mine, "forgive them if you can. Not for them, for you. Carrying anger is like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die." Those were the last coherent words he spoke to me. He slipped into unconsciousness that evening and passed away peacefully in the early hours of the morning as the first light was beginning to shimmer on the lake. I sat with him until the end, holding his weathered hand, thanking him for everything he had given me far beyond material support. The funeral was held 3 days later at the small church in town. I wore a simple black dress, nothing fancy. Harold would have approved. The church was surprisingly full, with people I didn't recognize mingling with a few familiar faces. Harold helped me start my business, one woman told me. Never wanted recognition. Said it was just the right thing to do. He paid for my daughter's medical treatment, an elderly man confided. Never asked for anything in return. Person after person approached with similar stories. The quiet philanthropist had touched more lives than I had realized. My parents arrived 20 minutes late, pulling up in a brand new luxury sedan I'd never seen before. My mother wore an expensive black designer suit with flashy diamond earrings. My father had a new watch that caught the light as he shook hands with the minister. As they made their way toward the front pew where I sat alone, I could hear my mother explaining loudly to anyone who would listen. His only son, she was saying, gesturing to my father. They were extremely close. We're absolutely devastated. I bit my tongue and focused on the framed photo of Harold on top of the simple casket. It showed him in his element, standing by the lake at sunset, fishing rod in hand. His face creased in a gentle smile. Throughout the service, my parents performed grief with theatrical precision. My mother dabbed at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. My father placed a supportive arm around her shoulders, his expression appropriately solemn. Adam sat beside them, uncomfortable in a suit too tight across his broad shoulders. Unlike our parents, his sadness seemed genuine. He caught my eye once and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. After the church service, we proceeded to the cemetery where Harold would be laid to rest beside his wife, my grandmother, who had died before I was born. As the minister spoke final words, I placed a single white lily on the casket, along with a small sketch I had made of the cabin. My mother stepped forward with an elaborate flower arrangement, positioning herself so everyone could see her moment of farewell. When she returned to my father's side, I heard her whisper, "When do we meet with the lawyer?" Even then, at the graveside of her father-in-law, her mind was on what she might gain. I closed my eyes, remembering Harold's words about forgiveness, wondering if I would ever be capable of it. The reading of Harold's will was scheduled for the following Monday at the offices of Wilson and Associates in downtown Boston, Mr. 12. Wilson was a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He had been Harold's attorney and friend for over 30 years. My parents arrived 15 minutes early, dressed impeccably. My mother wore another designer outfit, this one navy blue with gold buttons that screamed old money, though our family had never had any. My father had the confident air of a man about to receive good news. Adam came separately, giving me a brief, awkward hug before taking a seat against the wall. Several of Harold's business associates were present, along with his doctor and the director of one of the shelters his foundation supported. I sat quietly in a corner wearing clothes Harold would have approved of: simple, functional, no designer labels. My art school friends would have called it normcore. My mother kept glancing at my plain black pants and white blouse with barely concealed disapproval. "You could have made more of an effort, Jane," she whispered when she passed my chair. "This is an important occasion." I said nothing, remembering all the times Harold had told me, "What you wear matters far less than what you do." At precisely 10 o'clock, Mr. Wilson called the room to order. He began with standard legal preamble, then paused, looking around the room. "Before I continue, I want to say that Harold Armstrong was not just my client, but my friend. He was a man of exceptional character and quiet generosity. The instructions I am about to read reflect both his values and his clear-eyed assessment of those around him. My father shifted in his seat, shooting a confident smile at my mother. They clearly expected to be the primary beneficiaries. After all, Thomas was Harold's only child. Mr. Wilson opened a leather portfolio and began to read. I, Harold James Armstrong, being of sound mind and body, hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. He detailed some small bequests first. Harold's fishing equipment to his Thursday fishing buddy, his collection of first edition books to the local library, a modest sum to his housekeeper of 15 years. Then came the bombshell. As to the remainder of my estate, including all real property, financial assets, business interests, and personal belongings, the total value of which is approximately $20 million. A audible gasp went through the room. Even I was shocked by the figure, despite Harold's earlier disclosure. My parents leaned forward eagerly. I leave to the one person who has demonstrated the values I hold dear, compassion, integrity, and the understanding that wealth is not measured in dollars, but in how we care for one another. Mr. Wilson paused, looking directly at me. The heir to everything is the one who kept my secret safe. My mother's face contorted in confusion. My father's confident smile faltered. Jane Armstrong, Mr. Wilson continued, has been not only my granddaughter, but my partner in philanthropy, my caretaker in illness, and the true embodiment of the Armstrong legacy, as I wish it to be remembered. He looked up from the document. To be clear, Jane Armstrong inherits the entirety of Harold Armstrong's estate with the following conditions. My parents erupted in protest. My father stood, his face flushed with anger. This is outrageous. I'm his son. She manipulated him when he was ill, isolated him from his family. Mr. Wilson raised a hand. Mr. Armstrong, please be seated. There is more you need to hear. My mother was openly weeping now, though whether from grief or thwarted greed was impossible to tell. We were his family, she insisted. His real family. Were you? Mr. Wilson asked mildly. He reached into his briefcase and removed a USB drive, which he inserted into his laptop. Harold anticipated your reaction and prepared accordingly. The screen on the wall came to life, showing my grandfather sitting in his favorite chair by the fireplace. Though clearly ill, his eyes were sharp and his voice steady. If you're watching this recorded, Harold began, then I'm gone, and my will is being contested by those who believe blood entitles them to wealth they did nothing to earn. He went on to explain in painstaking detail how my parents had thrown me out at 15, how they had only reconnected when they believed he was dying, how their every interaction had been colored by their desire for his money. Most devastating was the inclusion of secretly recorded conversations, my parents discussing Harold's fortune while he was supposedly napping, my mother admitting she was just playing nice until the old man kicks it, my father speculating on how quickly they could sell the cabin once Harold was gone. The lake property must be worth a fortune now, he was heard saying. We could finally build that vacation home you've always wanted. The recording continued, showing a conversation from just weeks before Harold's death. My parents were in his study, not realizing he had installed a small camera after catching them searching through his papers. Once he's gone, we'll contest. Whatever will he's written, my father was saying. We'll claim Jane coerced him, that he wasn't of sound mind. No judge will give everything to a granddaughter over a son. We deserve this money, my mother agreed. We've put up with his simple living, his charitable nonsense for years. It's our turn now. As the recording ended, the room fell into stunned silence. My parents sat frozen, their expressions a mixture of rage and humiliation. Adam stared at the floor, unable to look at any of us. Mr. Wilson cleared his throat. Harold documented your behavior for years. There are dozens more recordings like these, all legally obtained under single-party consent laws. Should you choose to contest this, all of this evidence will be presented in court, becoming public record. He let that sink in before continuing. Additionally, Harold left a detailed accounting of his foundation's work, including Jane's integral role in it for the past 9 years. There are statements from beneficiaries, community leaders, and healthcare workers attesting to her character and commitment. My father stood abruptly. This is a setup. He was a sick old man who turned against his own son because of that girl. That girl, Mr. Wilson said quietly, was the only one who loved Harold for himself, not for what she could get from him. My mother grabbed her designer purse, her face twisted with anger. Come, Thomas. We don't have to listen to this. We'll fight it in court. Mr. Wilson shook his head. I strongly advise against that course of action, Mrs. Armstrong. Beyond the evidence you've just seen, there are financial records showing your attempts to access Harold's accounts without authorization that crosses from civil into criminal territory. The threat landed. My parents glanced at each other, a silent communication passing between them. Fine, my father snapped finally. Keep the money. It's blood money anyway. As they stormed toward the door, my mother paused, turning back to face me. I hope you're happy now. You've stolen what should have been our security, our future. I met her gaze steadily. I didn't steal anything, and neither will you. After they left, the room gradually emptied, until only Adam, Mr. Wilson, and I remained. My brother approached hesitantly. I had no idea, he said, about any of it. The recordings, the money, how they treated you. I believed him. Adam had been a child himself when I was thrown out, sheltered from the uglier realities of our parents' behavior. What will you do now? He asked. I looked at Mr. Wilson, who gave me an encouraging nod. What Harold would want, I said. Continue his work, live. Simply help where I can. Adam nodded, then reached out to squeeze my shoulder before leaving. It wasn't forgiveness or reconciliation, not yet, but it was a beginning. When we were alone, Mr. Wilson handed me a sealed envelope. Harold asked me to give you this privately, he said, for your eyes only. Inside was a handwritten letter, Harold's familiar scrawl, slightly shakier than I remembered. My dearest Janie, if you're reading this, the storm has passed. I'm sorry for any pain the revelations may have caused, but truth, however difficult, is always preferable to comfortable lies. You now have resources beyond what most can imagine. Use them wisely, as I know you will. Remember our talks by the lake. Money is just a tool. Your art, your compassion, your integrity, these are your true wealth. I love you, granddaughter. Not because you cared for me in my final days, not because you kept my secrets, but because of who you are. The cabin is yours now, but more importantly, so is the mission. Continue it in your own way, with your own vision. Find joy, Janie. Create beauty. Help others. And when your time comes, pass these values on, not just the money. With all my love, Harold. I folded the letter carefully, tears blurring my vision. In death as in life, Harold had given me not just material support, but wisdom, perspective, and love, without conditions. Outside Mr. Wilson's office, the autumn sun was bright on the Boston streets. I stood for a moment, feeling the weight of responsibility and the lightness of possibility in equal measure. $20 million. A foundation to run, a legacy to honor. And somewhere in the midst of it all, my own path to forge. In the weeks following the will reading, I moved between grief and purpose, between mourning Harold and carrying forward his vision. The cabin felt empty without him, but also somehow full of his presence. I would find myself turning to share a thought with him only to remember he was gone. My parents, as Mr. Wilson had predicted, did not contest the will. The evidence against them was too overwhelming, the risk of public exposure too great. Instead, they retreated into bitter silence, refusing all contact. I hadn't expected anything different, but it still hurt in a dull, familiar way. The final confirmation that they had never loved me as a daughter, only as a potential pathway to wealth. Adam, however, surprised me. He called regularly, asking thoughtful questions about Harold, about my art, about the foundation. "I want to understand," he said during one conversation. "I feel like I grew up in a completely different family than you did." "You did," I told him. "They were different parents to you than they were to me." He was quiet for a moment. "That doesn't make it right." We began a careful rebuilding of our relationship, meeting for coffee when he was in Boston, exchanging emails about our lives. It wasn't immediate forgiveness, but it was a start. Meanwhile, I faced the enormous responsibility Harold had entrusted to me. $20 million was a sum I could barely comprehend. I could have bought a mansion, traveled the world, lived in luxury for the rest of my life. Instead, I sat down with Mr. Wilson and Harold's financial advisors to understand exactly how he had structured his philanthropy. The foundation currently supports 12 ongoing initiatives, Mr. Wilson explained, showing me detailed spreadsheets. Scholarships for underprivileged students, funding for 3 domestic violence shelters, microloans for small businesses in disadvantaged communities, and so on. I recognized most of the programs from my work with Harold over the years, but seeing the full scope in black and white was overwhelming. "How did he manage all this alone?" I asked. Mr. Wilson smiled. "He didn't. He had you." Over the next 6 months, I formalized what had been Harold's personal mission into the Harold Armstrong Foundation. I hired a small, dedicated staff to handle the day-to-day operations, but kept my grandfather's philosophy at the center. No public recognition, no buildings with the Armstrong name, just quiet, consistent support where it was needed most. I kept the cabin, unable to part with the place that held so many memories, but I also bought a small commercial building in Boston's Art District. The ground floor became my studio and gallery space. The upper floors I converted into subsidized apartments for emerging artists who needed affordable housing. Living with wealth proved to be a complex adjustment. I found myself hesitating over simple purchases, hearing Harold's voice. Is it necessary? Is it meaningful? Will it last? I didn't change my wardrobe for designer labels or buy an expensive car. I furnished my apartment above the studio with second-hand pieces. I restored myself a skill Harold had taught me years before. The one luxury I allowed myself was travel not to resorts or famous cities, but to places where I could learn from local artists and support grassroots community projects. I visited a women's textile cooperative in Guatemala, an arts education program in Detroit, a rural pottery collective in Japan. Each trip expanded my perspective and influenced my art, which was evolving from traditional landscapes to more complex works, examining themes of family legacy and belonging. About a year after Harold's death, I received an unexpected email from my father. The subject line read, simply, meeting. The message was brief. "Jane, I'd like to talk. No lawyers, no accusations. Just talk. Can we meet?" I considered ignoring it, but Harold's last words to me echoed, "Forgive them if you can. Not for them, for you." We met at a neutral location, a coffee shop, halfway between Boston and my parents' suburb. My father looked older than I, remembered the confident businessman replaced by someone more uncertain. "Thank you for coming," he said as we sat down. "I don't quite know where to begin." "Why did you want to see me?" I asked directly. He stared into his coffee cup. Your mother and I are divorcing. After everything with your grandfather's will, it forced some realizations I'd been avoiding for a long time. He went on to explain that the marriage had been unraveling for years, held together by shared material aspirations and social climbing. When those dreams collapsed with Harold's will, there was nothing left. I've been thinking about what your grandfather said in that video, he continued, about values and what really matters. I was raised to believe success meant money status, the right address, the right car. I listened silently, neither encouraging nor discouraging his confession. I failed as a father, he said, finally, meeting my eyes. I failed spectacularly. I can't undo what happened when you were 15. I can't change how we treated you or Harold. But I want you to know, I see it now. I see what we did. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was more acknowledgement than I had ever expected. Why tell me this now? I asked. Because I'm trying to change, he said simply, and I can't do that without facing the worst thing I ever did. We talked for nearly 2 hours. I didn't promise forgiveness or a renewed relationship, but I did agree to meet again. It was a small opening in what had seemed a permanently closed door. My mother, however, remained entrenched in bitterness. Through Adam, I heard she had moved to Florida, remarried quickly to a wealthy retiree, and told anyone who would listen that her children had abandoned her. Some people can't change, Adam observed when he told me. They can't even see the need for it. One evening, as I was closing my gallery after a successful show, a young woman lingered, studying my most recent painting. It showed the cabin by the lake at dawn, a solitary figure standing on the dock. This one feels different from your other work, she said. There's a peace in it, but also a sense of moving forward. I smiled. That's exactly what I was trying to capture. She introduced herself as Lily, an art student struggling to find her voice. Something in her uncertain determination reminded me of myself at that age. My professor says my work is technically good, but lacks emotional depth, she confessed. I don't know how to fix that. I thought of Harold, how he had seen something in me worth nurturing. Art isn't just technique, I told her. It's about honesty, about putting your truth on the canvas even when it's uncomfortable. That conversation led to others. I began mentoring Lily, then other young artists. I established a scholarship program separate from the foundation specifically for students pursuing arts education despite financial or family obstacles. 2 years after Harold's death, I found myself sitting on the dock at the cabin, watching the sun set over the lake. I had brought Harold's journal with me, rereading his entries from decades past. One passage particularly resonated. True wealth isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in moments of connection, in the knowledge that you've made someone else's burden lighter, in leaving the world slightly better than you found it. Money is just paper. Legacy is what you build in others. I closed the journal understanding now what Harold had been teaching me all along. Family isn't always blood. Wealth isn't always money. Success isn't measured by what you accumulate, but by what you contribute. The cabin would always be my sanctuary, but my life had expanded beyond what either Harold or I could have imagined. The foundation was thriving, supporting more programs each year. My art was finding its audience. And most importantly, I was building my own family of choice, a network of friends, mentees, and colleagues connected by shared values rather than shared DNA. I still had moments of anger when I thought about my parents throwing me out at 15, calling me a burden. But those moments grew less frequent, less intense. Harold had been right about forgiveness being for my benefit, not theirs. As the last light faded from the sky, I made a promise to myself and to Harold's memory. I would continue to live according to the principles he had taught me: generosity without expectation of recognition, wealth as a responsibility rather than a privilege, and the understanding that the most valuable inheritance isn't money, but wisdom. The $20 million estate had changed my life, but not in the ways most people would expect. It hadn't made me happier or more fulfilled. That had come from the deeper legacy Harold had left me, the knowledge that I was worthy of love, capable of resilience, and responsible for creating meaning in my own life. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I whispered a thank you to the man who had saved me in every way a person can be saved, and who continued to guide me even in his absence. What's the most valuable inheritance you've ever received? It might not be money or property, but perhaps wisdom, values, or love. Share your story in the comments below. And if this resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who might need to hear it. Remember that sometimes our greatest blessings come disguised as our greatest challenges. Thank you for listening to my story today.